The mug stayed cold, but the trail was burning hot. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me where you're tuning in from. I love seeing this community connect. Your words make this journey special. Now, the mystery begins. I'd been keeping the chair across from Wolfe's desk warm for the better part of an hour, which was not a bad way to spend the time if you didn't mind being ignored. Wolfe was on one of his intellectual vacations. Eyes closed, lips pressed tight, and fingers steepled against his stomach as though holding down an argument he was having with himself. He wasn't asleep. I could tell by the occasional flex of his nose, like a hound getting a faint whiff of something disagreeable. If I interrupted, he'd grumble about impertinence, so I didn't. The brownstone, as usual, was quiet enough to make you wonder if the outside world had gone extinct. Fritz was in the kitchen, no doubt fussing with some imported mushrooms that cost more per pound than my shoes, and Theodore was upstairs with the orchids, humming to them in that tone of devotion he saves for plants and never for people. That left me, Wolfe, and the typewriter, which I wasn't touching because the last report had gone in yesterday. Then came the knock. It wasn't the kind of knock you get from a delivery boy who wants to dump a crate on your stoop. It had weight behind it. One solid rap, followed by a pause, then two more. It said whoever was on the other side wasn't eager but wasn't shy either. Since I'm the official door opener of the establishment, I hauled myself up and answered. The man on the stoop was tall, clean suit, dark hair combed like it had been rehearsed. He carried nothing except a small leather case, the kind you see with lawyers who haven't yet figured out they're supposed to carry bigger ones to look impressive. He smiled, thin and respectful, but I could tell he was carrying more tension than a violin string. "Archie Goodwin," he asked. "That's me." "You the Census Bureau?" "No, my name is Victor Talbot. May I come in?" I gave him a once-over. He didn't look like a crook, but crooks don't often advertise. Something about him screamed urgent errand boy with money behind him. I held the door long enough to make him sweat before stepping aside. "Follow me." "Try not to disturb the furniture. Mr. Wolfe takes offense at that sort of thing." We walked into the office, Wolfe still in his chair with the same closed eyes, as if he had installed a sign that said, "Disturb at your peril." I did the honors. "Boss, this is Victor Talbot. He didn't bring flowers, but he did bring a case. I'll let you decide whether that improves his odds of survival." Wolfe opened one eye, then the other, and performed the miracle of movement by shifting his hand 2 inches to indicate the red leather chair. "Sit," he said. Talbot did, perching on the edge like a man waiting for judgment. I stayed standing, leaning against the desk, because sometimes that gives a visitor the right sense of balance. Me informal, Wolfe imperial. "I apologize for intruding," Talbot began. His voice had a lawyer's smoothness, but cracked at the edges. "I was told you accept clients only when sufficiently intrigued." "I hope to intrigue you. That remains to be seen," Wolfe replied. He reached for his beer, sipped, set it down, and let the glass rest there like punctuation. "Proceed." Talbot opened his case, not pulling out papers, but a single object wrapped in cloth. He laid it on Wolfe's desk and unwrapped it carefully, as though unveiling something sacred. It was a mug, plain porcelain, white with a faint blue rim. The kind of mug you'd expect at a diner, not in our office. I squinted at it. "Congratulations. You've brought Wolfe breakfast." Only 3 hours late, Talbot didn't laugh. He looked at Wolfe, not me. The mug was filled with hot coffee 3 nights ago, left on a desk in my firm's office. At 10 o'clock. When we returned at midnight, the coffee was cold, untouched, as if it had been waiting, but the man who had poured it was gone. He hasn't been seen since I raised a brow. So, people step out all the time. Yes, but this man, Harold Dunning, had just completed drafting a document worth, conservatively, $5 million to our clients. It has vanished. He has vanished. And all that remains on the desk, perfectly positioned, was this mug. Cold Wolfe grunted. Not approval, not interest. Just the grunt he gives when he decides the oxygen is worth expending. Talbot leaned forward. It is not simply theft. It is insult. The mug has become a symbol, whispered about in corridors. Partners suspect betrayal. Associates suspect sabotage. I was advised that Nero Wolfe has a reputation for solving such symbolic puzzles. That caught Wolfe. He shifted in his chair, fingers twitching once, then still. You transported this trophy to me? Yes. To demonstrate the seriousness, to request your intervention. Our firm cannot proceed without clarity, and we cannot go to the police without ruin. I whistled low. So you want us to find your missing man and your missing millions, and you've got nothing but a cold cup of joe? Talbot's jaw clenched. I want Mr. Wolfe to uncover what lies beneath the mug. Why it was left, what it means. For a long moment, Wolfe said nothing. He gazed at the mug as though trying to decide whether it was an affront to porcelain or humanity. Then he sighed. One of those long, heavy exhalations that means his brain has already leapt 6 moves ahead. Pfui, he said softly. A bauble, a gesture, but a gesture of deliberate weight. Mr. Goodwin, present. Take Mr. Talbot's particulars. His firm, his associates, the absent Dunning. Secure times, locations, and character assessments. Return before dinner. That was Wolfe's way of saying, we were in. Without saying, we were in. I gave Talbot a nod. You're in luck, counselor. You just hired the laziest genius in New York and his unpaid chauffeur. Fee schedule's in the mail. Meanwhile, tell me more about Dunning. Start with whether he drinks his coffee. Black Talbot blinked at me, then managed a thin smile. For the first time, I saw relief slip into his posture. He began to talk, spilling details about Harold Dunning, the reliable partner, the sudden anxieties, the late-night drafting sessions, the whispered tensions in the firm. Wolfe sat silent, his gaze never leaving the mug. And I, Archie Goodwin, started to get the itch, the one that says life in the brownstone has been disturbed, and we were about to spend the next week knee-deep in other people's ambitions, betrayals, and lies. It all started with a mug that stayed cold. Continue the story while maintaining a strong, logical flow that connects seamlessly with the previous part. The transition should feel natural and engaging, ensuring the investigation unfolds smoothly. Every event must build upon the last, leading toward the next development without abrupt shifts. Follow these guidelines. Keep the narrative tightly connected to the previous section. Ensure the timeline remains strong and coherent. No unnecessary jumps or diversions. The tone, pacing, and style must match the established flow. Maintain suspense and intrigue while guiding the story toward the next key moment. Avoid headlines or section breaks. The story should feel continuous and immersive. Always respond directly in chat without breaking the story format. Victor Talbot stayed perched on the edge of the red leather chair, like he was waiting for a verdict from the Supreme Court. He'd been talking steady for 10 minutes, laying out the essentials of his missing man, Harold Dunning. According to Talbot, Dunning was the kind of partner who kept his head down and his pencil sharp, the sort who rarely ruffled feathers but had lately grown jittery, coming in early, staying late, locking drawers that nobody used to bother locking. It was the kind of nervousness that either meant you were hiding an ulcer or hiding something worse. Wolfe let him run on until the repetition got thicker than Fritz's gravy. At that point, he closed his eyes and gave a small grunt, which was the equivalent of a red light at an intersection. Talbot stopped mid-sentence, checked his watch, then looked at me as if to confirm he hadn't said too much. "You've told us Dunning drafted a document of substantial value," Wolfe said finally, his voice deep and steady, like it had been aging in a barrel. What document? Talbot hesitated, his gaze flicking from Wolfe to me and back again. A merger agreement between Grant, Lowell, and Burnside, our firm, and an international shipping concern. The final version contained terms no one outside the partnership had yet seen. Confidentiality was paramount. If compromised, he trailed off. Wolfe's lids half lifted. So, if Dunning absconded with it, he could sell it. If he was intercepted, another could sell it. Either way, your concern is not for Dunning, but for the document. Talbot flushed, as if Wolfe had stripped him in public. Dunning was a valued partner. Of course, his welfare matters, I cut in. But not as much as $5 million on the line. He didn't argue, which told me more than his careful words. Wolfe reached for his beer glass, found it empty, and made the small huff of disapproval that meant I should fetch another. I went to the kitchen, passing Fritz, who was elbow-deep in something that smelled like garlic heaven. He gave me a look that asked if this was another of Wolfe's paying headaches, and I shrugged because I wasn't sure yet. Beer in hand, I returned to the office, set it on Wolfe's coaster, and leaned back against the desk. "Mr. Talbot," Wolfe said, after wetting his throat, "you will prepare a complete roster of those with knowledge of the document's contents or of Mr. Dunning's labors. I require names, connections, and temperaments. You will include any frictions within your firm that Dunning may have been party to. Deliver it here within 24 hours. Talbot shifted, clearly wanting to object. "But surely you must begin. Time is critical." Wolfe's glare could have pickled vegetables. "I do not begin, sir. I continue. You will provide what I asked, or there will be nothing to continue." I could see the lawyer in him wanting to argue precedence, but he swallowed it down. He rose, carefully rewrapping the mug like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom. "You will hear from me tomorrow," he said. "Not tomorrow," Wolfe corrected, eyes closing again. "Today." By evening, Talbot nodded stiffly and made his way out, shoes clicking across the parquet. I followed him to the door, partly because I was supposed to, and partly because I wanted to see if he looked back. He didn't. Once he was gone, I shut the door, returned to the office, and gave Wolfe the raised eyebrow treatment. "Well?" I asked. "Phooey." Wolfe settled deeper into the chair. "We are to play nursemaid to lawyers. A contemptible exercise." "Then why bother?" His eyes opened just enough to find mine. "Because the gesture was deliberate. The mug, left cold, is not merely an oversight. It is an assertion that gave me something to chew on." I perched again. "You think somebody planted it to make a point?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that men who vanish with documents do not leave mementos unless compelled. Mr. Talbot does not grasp this, but I do. You will attend him. Fetch the particulars. Exercise your charm on his colleagues. That was Wolfe's way of sending me out into the jungle while he stayed in the palace. I knew the drill. The next morning, I took the subway downtown to the firm's office on 47th, where Talbot had arranged an introduction with his managing partner, a man named Edward Grant. The firm occupied a floor that smelled like waxed ambition, and the receptionist looked at me like I was overdue on alimony before sending me through. Grant was older than Talbot, with hair the color of cigarette ash and a voice that carried the authority of someone who didn't need to shout. He shook my hand with dry fingers and gestured me into a chair across from his desk, which was the size of a Buick. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, not warmly, "Victor tells me Mr. Wolfe has agreed to look into this matter." "That's right. Wolfe asked me to get a sense of your firm's players. Starting with you." His lips tightened. "I assure you, Mr. Goodwin, the partnership is sound. Harold Dunning's disappearance is a concern, but it does not implicate us." "Maybe not. Still, humor me. Dunning's work habits, his mood lately, anyone he wasn't on good terms with?" Grant's gaze sharpened. He didn't like being prodded, but he wasn't fool enough to clam up. Dunning was diligent. reliable. But recently he seemed troubled, distracted. There were whispers about disagreements with Lowell, one of our other partners. Nothing public, but tension enough I noted that. What kind of disagreements? Grant hesitated, then said, over strategy. Dunning felt the firm was aligning too closely with certain clients of dubious repute. Lowell disagreed. I let silence stretch until he fidgeted with a paperweight. Then I leaned forward. Anybody else? His eyes flicked. Burnside, our junior partner. Ambitious. He and Dunning worked together on drafts. There were disputes. Burnside wants to climb quickly. Dunning may have been in his way. That gave me 3 names: Lowell, Burnside, and now Grant himself. Not a bad start for suspects. By noon, I'd cornered Lowell in his office, a man with slicked back hair and a cologne that arrived 2 seconds before he did. He swore he and Dunning had no quarrel worth noting, but his eyes slid sideways when I asked if he'd seen the missing draft. Burnside, younger and hungrier, offered a performance of outrage at the idea Dunning would vanish with something so valuable, but his handshake was clammy and his laugh too quick. By the time I left the firm, I had a notebook full of contradictions, egos, and motive. I didn't have the missing man or the document, but I had enough to know the mug wasn't the only thing going cold in that office. Back at the brownstone, I laid it all out for Wolfe. He listened with his lids shut, fingers moving like fat caterpillars across his belly. When I finished, he opened his eyes and gave a single nod. So, a triumvirate of suspects, each with motive and opportunity, and a missing man who might be a thief, a victim, or both, I added. Wolfe sighed. And a mug, Mr. Goodwin. Do not neglect the mug. Its presence is the only fact not subject to human frailty. I grinned. Fine. I'll remember to pay homage to the sacred coffee cup. Do, he said, for therein lies the insult. And the insult, Archie, is the key. The brownstone has a way of staying serene even when the world outside is spinning itself dizzy. But that morning the calm was perforated by the sound of voices that didn't belong. Wolfe had ordered Victor Talbot to gather his colleagues, and Talbot, being the dutiful messenger, complied, which meant that for the first time in a long while, the sanctity of Wolfe's office was invaded by not 1 but 3 lawyers, Grant, Lowell, and Burnside, each carrying enough ego to fill the room twice over. I'd set the chairs, polished the ashtrays, and braced myself for the kind of storm you only get when partners in a firm have to share space without a boardroom table between them. Fritz gave me a sympathetic glance when he heard the bell and saw the parade coming in. He retreated fast enough to avoid being conscripted as a witness. Grant entered first, tall and composed, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved out of marble for the express purpose of presiding over other people's misfortunes. Behind him came Lowell, slimmer, hair slicked down like he'd been shellacked, with a grin that might have been charming if it hadn't been so deliberate. Burnside trailed, his youth showing in his restless eyes and quick movements like a dog that hasn't yet decided whether to bark or bite. Talbot introduced them stiffly, as if apologizing to the furniture for letting them sit on it. Wolfe didn't bother rising, of course. He merely inclined his head and gestured toward the chairs. They obeyed, though not without glances at each other, the kind that told me they would have preferred a battlefield to our office. Wolfe let silence fill the room. He was good at that, letting people squirm under the weight of their own impatience. Finally, he opened his eyes and spoke. Gentlemen, you are here because a partner of your firm, Harold Dunning, has vanished. He has taken with him a document of material worth. He has left behind. His gaze moved like a slow pendulum to the cloth-wrapped bundle Talbot had set on the corner of the desk. An artifact. This mug. Explain yourselves, Grant shifted. Mr. Wolfe, with respect, I fail to see how the presence of a coffee mug bears any... Pooh! Wolfe cut him off, the word dropping like a manhole cover. You fail to see because you refuse to look. A man vanishes, a document vanishes, yet this object remains. It is not nothing, it is assertion. Who benefits from such an assertion? That stopped Grant cold. He pressed his lips together and didn't answer. Lowell, however, was less cautious. Look, we all want Dunning back. The firm is paralyzed without him. But if you're suggesting one of us planted that mug— I suggested no such thing, Wolfe said, lifting a finger. I suggest only that the mug was left with intent. Mr. Goodwin has been among you, has observed your temperaments, your ambitions, your disagreements. He will report I took the cue, because Wolfe never wastes one. I stood easy, leaning against the desk, and gave them the Goodwin once over. Grant, you play statesman, but even statesmen have to dirty their hands sometimes. Lowell, you've got polish, but you've also got a nervous tick that says you've been playing a deeper game than you admit. And Burnside, well, you're ambitious enough to eat your way up the ladder if someone doesn't stop you first. Each of you had reason to want Dunning's draft, or to want him out of the way. The mug, to my eye, is somebody's calling card. A little show to prove who's really running the play. Burnside flushed and leaned forward. That's absurd. Why would any of us jeopardize the firm's reputation? I grinned. You tell me. Ambition has done stranger things. The tension thickened like Fritz's hollandaise. Wolfe closed his eyes again, the better to ignore the hissing, and spoke in that flat tone of his that always sounded like scripture. The fact remains. Each of you knew of Dunning's draft. Each of you had motive. The resolution will emerge not from your protestations, but from your contradictions. And contradictions you have in abundance. Grant rose slightly, affronted. Are you accusing us? I accuse nothing, Wolfe said. I observe. And I shall observe further. That was the dismissal, though none of them recognized it until I guided them toward the door with a smile sharp enough to nick fingers. Talbot lingered, murmuring apologies, then hurried out after them, leaving the brownstone to breathe again. I returned to the office, closing the door softly. Wolfe sat with his eyes shut, the mug still resting in its cloth, as if it were some exotic specimen delivered for his inspection. Well, I said, if you wanted fireworks, you got them. Grant, stiff as a board, Lowell smirking like he's in on a joke, Burnside practically chewing his nails. If Dunning did vanish on purpose, he couldn't have picked a better time. They're ready to eat each other alive. Indeed, Wolfe murmured, and yet none touched the mug. Why would they? He opened his eyes, heavy with thought. Because the mug is the insult. To leave it unremarked is to deny the insult. Yet none of them so much as glanced at it. That, Archie, is too neat, too careful. They were aware of it deeply, but feigned ignorance. That is a fact. I let that hang in the air while I poured myself a glass of milk from the sideboard. So what's next? Saul Panza, a tale on Lowell, a fishing trip with Burnside. Not yet. Wolfe shifted, a monumental thing in itself. First, we establish the scope. Mr. Talbot will provide further particulars this evening. Then, Mr. Goodwin, you will pry open what these men guard so jealously. Their private indulgences. A man's public motives are seldom the true ones. I nodded, already considering which strings to pull. And the mug? The mug remains. It will tell us more than these men in time. But for now, it waits. And so do we. That was Wolfe's final word for the afternoon. He closed his eyes, retreated into stillness, and left me to stew in the aftermath. I sat down, lit a cigarette, and thought about Harold Dunning, a man who had apparently disappeared between one sip and the next, leaving behind not just cold coffee, but a message nobody wanted to admit was written for them. It wasn't murder, at least not yet, but it had the taste of something close, betrayal brewed strong, ambition left to cool, and secrets clinging to the rim of a cheap porcelain mug. And if I knew Wolfe, he'd keep staring at it until the whole thing spilled over. Wolfe might have been content to let the lawyer stew, but I wasn't. He told me to pry, and when Wolfe tells me to pry, it means I get to do what I do best. Ask questions nobody wants to answer, then write it down in a neat little notebook before somebody decides to clam up. That evening, Talbot delivered the particulars Wolfe had demanded. Addresses, backgrounds, the kind of sanitized biographies law firms like to print in glossy pamphlets. I didn't need the gloss, I needed the dirt. The mug might have been Wolfe's fetish object, but for me, the trail was always made of people. The next morning, I set out with the list in my pocket and enough patience to wade through a pond of liars. First stop was Edward Grant. His office had already given me a taste of his personality, rigid, polished, careful. But I wanted to see the man outside the marble desk and brass nameplate. That meant trailing him at lunch. Sure enough, I caught him leaving the building at 12:30, sharp overcoat buttoned, eyes straight ahead. He walked with the certainty of a man who expected traffic lights to change for him. I let him get half a block before I fell in, casual but close enough to note the direction. He didn't head to the club or a steakhouse, which surprised me. Instead, he slipped into a quiet cafe on a side street. Low lights, red booths, the kind of place you take someone you don't want the office to know about. Through the front window, I saw him slide into a booth across from a woman in a navy coat. She wasn't a partner, and she wasn't his secretary. The way she leaned forward, smiling with too much warmth, told me she was either family or more than family. They talked intently for 20 minutes. I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. The body language said plenty. When Grant reached across the table to touch her wrist, I had my answer. Married man. Discreet rendezvous. Nothing criminal, but the kind of thing that makes you vulnerable. Vulnerability was motive's twin brother. I filed it away and followed him back to the office, then peeled off. Lowell was next. Sleek, perfumed Lowell, who'd looked me in the eye yesterday with the kind of grin that says he's already rehearsing his testimony. I staked him out after hours. He didn't disappoint. At 6, he left the office with a briefcase and headed not for home, but to a townhouse on the east side. I waited across the street, watched him knock, and saw the door answered by a man I recognized from the society pages. An importer with more money than friends. They greeted each other like old accomplices. When the curtains drew and the lights glowed, I knew Lowell's extracurriculars included connections well outside the law firm's clean corridors. Connections like that could turn a missing document into a bargaining chip. Burnside was trickier. Young, sharp, and desperate to prove himself, he kept late hours at the firm, leaving long after the janitors. That meant if he had anything to hide, it wasn't tucked away in his office. I decided to test him directly. I dropped by unannounced around 8, breezing in like I had every right to be there. He blinked at me, startled, then tried to cover it with bravado. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, pretending calm. "What brings you here?" "Curiosity," I told him. That and Wolfe's appetite. He likes a steady diet of facts. Care to provide a course? He laughed too quickly. There's nothing to tell. Dunning worked on the draft. He vanished. I stayed here trying to clean up the mess I leaned on his desk. Funny thing. People say you two didn't get along. His jaw tightened. Disagreements, yes. But not enough to make me wish him gone. Maybe not wish him gone, I said. But maybe wish him embarrassed. If he'd fumbled that draft, you'd be next in line to save the day. Heroics do wonders for ambition. He flushed, and I knew I'd struck home. He barked a denial, but his voice had the wobble of a man trying to nail down a floorboard that kept springing loose. By the time I left, I had a sketch of all three. Grant with his hidden romance, Lowell with his society ties, Burnside with his gnawing hunger. None of it proved they'd lifted Dunning or the document, but all of it gave Wolfe ammunition. I returned to the brownstone after 10. Wolfe was in his chair, orchids tended, Fritz in the kitchen. The office smelled of beer and books, a combination that somehow worked. I laid out my findings piece by piece, while Wolfe sat still as a monument. When I finished, he opened his eyes. So, 3 men, 3 weaknesses. Mr. Grant compromised, Mr. Lowell entangled, Mr. Burnside overeager. Satisfactory. Satisfactory for what? I asked. For leverage. The truth, Archie, does not come freely. It must be purchased, bartered, or pried loose. Their weaknesses will oblige them to speak when denial no longer serves. I lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl. That's fine, but what about Dunning? You're still assuming he didn't just run off with the draft and the cash. Pfui! He did not run. He was made to vanish. The mug confirms it. I rolled my eyes. The sacred mug again. What makes you so sure? Wolfe leaned forward slightly, which for him was like another man leaping onto the table, because a man fleeing does not leave a message. A man's silence does not leave one either, but a man coerced into disappearance, that man leaves a token. The mug, cold, deliberate, untouched. It says, "Here is the absence. Attend to it." I had no answer for that, except a grudging nod. Wolfe might be infuriating, but when he put it like that, the logic stuck. He closed his eyes once more. Tomorrow, Archie, you will press further. Invite them to reveal themselves subtly, and we shall see who cracks first. Meanwhile, Mr. Talbot is to be reminded that payment is due. Right, I said, the part of the job I actually enjoy. He grunted, which meant conversation over. I sat back, listening to the steady tick of the clock, and thought about Dunning, wherever he was. Somewhere out there, a lawyer had vanished and left behind a mug like a riddle. And here in the brownstone, Wolfe was already untying the knot, while the rest of us were still finding the string. It wasn't murder yet, but it had teeth. And if Wolfe was right, those teeth were going to show soon. The brownstone has rules, and one of them is simple. Nothing gets disturbed without Wolfe knowing it, or me catching hell for letting it happen. That's why the moment I noticed something was off in the office, the back of my neck got tight. It was the next afternoon, and I'd gone to file Wolfe's latest round of instructions, my notes on Grant, Lowell, and Burnside, into the cabinet where we keep the live cases. Only the drawer didn't open smooth. It stuck for a fraction of a second, like it had been handled recently by someone with less finesse. When I finally pulled it, I saw the folder wasn't sitting the way I left it. It had been nudged just enough to register with someone who notices details for a living. I stood there staring at it, chewing the inside of my cheek. Wolfe hadn't left his chair in days. Theodore never touched anything outside the plant rooms, and Fritz wouldn't dream of messing with our files. Which left me, and I knew damn well it wasn't me. That meant we'd had a guest. I closed the drawer quietly and turned. Wolfe was in his chair, eyes closed, as still as a statue. You'd think he was asleep until you realized his fingers were flexing just slightly, as though he'd been waiting for me to notice. "Well," he said without opening his eyes. "Well," I replied, "either we've got a poltergeist with a thing for case files, or somebody's been trespassing in our private drawers." His lips compressed. "Which folder? The one with my notes on our charming trio?" "Somebody's been peeking." He opened his eyes then, slow and heavy, and fixed them on me. "And you are certain?" "Boss, I put those notes in neat as Fritz's table setting. Now they look like somebody shoved them back in with gloves on. Pfui." He shifted his weight, which for Wolfe counted as alarm. "This is intolerable." I didn't need him to spell it out. The brownstone isn't just an address. It's Wolfe's fortress. The idea of someone slipping past our threshold to meddle in his sanctum was enough to sour his mood worse than a bad batch of beer. "Any suspects?" I asked. He closed his eyes again. "All of them." Mr. Talbot, perhaps eager to know how I judged his colleagues, or one of the partners themselves, seeking foreknowledge of my conclusions. But the act itself, subtle, concealed, suggests desperation. Mr. Goodwin, the insult deepens. He let that hang while I prowled the office, checking for any other signs. Nothing obvious. No footprints, no smudges. Just that tiny shift in a drawer. A message as deliberate as the mug. That evening, Fritz called me into the kitchen under the pretense of tasting a sauce. Once I obliged, he lowered his voice. "Archie, I saw someone near the office door this afternoon. I was in the hall with the laundry. A shadow, only for a moment. When I returned, it was gone." I set the spoon down. "You didn't mention it sooner." He looked wounded. Mr. Wolfe insists on silence during his afternoons. I did not wish to disturb him without proof. "Proof enough," I said grimly. Back in the office, I relayed Fritz's sighting. Wolfe listened without interruption, then nodded once. "So, the trespass was not imagination. Someone entered my house. That, Archie, is a declaration of war. Do we call Saul?" I asked. "Not yet. Saul is for the open field. This demands subtlety. We shall bait them, Archie. Bait them properly." He didn't elaborate, which meant he already had a plan simmering behind those closed lids. My job was to wait until he decided to dish it out. The next day I visited Talbot under the guise of collecting more background. He was nervous, more so than before. He kept asking if Wolfe had formed an opinion, if we were making progress. I gave him nothing but shrugs and vague promises. If he was the trespasser, he wasn't going to confess over tea. Still, his twitchy demeanor put him high on my list. That evening, Wolfe had me check every lock, every window, every possible entry point. All secure. Yet the feeling lingered that someone had already been in and might try again. Wolfe sat behind his desk, hands folded, eyes fixed on the mug as if waiting for it to whisper the culprit's name. "Archie," he said finally, "there is a rhythm to insolence. First the mug, now the intrusion. The hand that leaves traces is the same hand that fears being discovered. Soon it will overreach. And what do we do in the meantime?" He opened his eyes, sharp now, and almost smiled. "We watch. We listen. And when the hand moves again, we close upon it." I didn't like it. Waiting never sat well with me. But Wolfe was right more often than comfort allowed. Someone had crossed the line into our territory. The brownstone had been touched, disturbed, and that meant the game wasn't just about Dunning or a vanished document anymore. It was about pride, power, and Wolfe's refusal to let an insult stand unanswered. I spent the night half awake in my room upstairs, ears tuned for the faintest creak. But nothing came. Whoever had slipped in once was lying low, for now. Still, I knew this much. The brownstone had been marked, and Wolfe would not rest until the mark was answered. The mug had started it, but the trespass had made it personal. Whoever was behind it had just made the mistake of turning Wolfe's curiosity into fury, and if history had taught me anything, it was that fury in that chair never ended well for the guilty. It was Wolfe who broke the stillness, not me. The following morning, he summoned me with a grunt that meant business, not breakfast. I found him in his chair, heavy as a throne, his eyes fixed not on his book but on the telephone. That in itself was unusual enough. "Archie," he said, "call Mr. Panzer." Saul Panzer is the ace up any sleeve worth holding. If you need quiet eyes, silent feet, or a brain that can keep up with Wolfe's, Saul is the man you hire. Wolfe doesn't use him lightly, so when he told me to make the call, I knew the trespass had hit him harder than he wanted to admit. I dialed Saul, gave him the short version, and handed Wolfe the receiver. Wolfe didn't waste words. "Saul, there has been an intrusion. Someone entered this house. I require surveillance, discreet, thorough. Begin at once. You will watch Talbot, Grant, Lowell, and Burnside. Their movements, their associates, especially their knights." Then he hung up. No pleasantries. Wolfe leaned back, folding his hands. "Now we wait for Mr. Panzer's findings. In the meantime, Archie, you will stir the pot. Stir how?" I asked. He closed his eyes. "Tell each of them that I know more than I do. They will scurry. The guilty one will scurry most," I grinned. "You're setting me up as the rat with the torch in the barn." "Precisely. So I did. That afternoon I paid calls on the trio, Grant first, catching him in his office with the blinds half drawn. I leaned against his desk and said, casual as a milkman, "Wolfe's piecing it together, you know. The mug, the timing, the vanishing act. He'll have a name soon." Grant stiffened, smoothed his tie, and muttered something about confidence in our discretion. But I saw the flicker of sweat at his temple. Lowell was next, lounging in his office like a cat waiting for cream. I dropped the same line. His grin faltered just for a second, before he covered it with charm. "Well then, I hope Wolfe names the right man. It would be dreadful if his reputation stumbled that sounded harmless until you caught the edge in his voice." Burnside, youngest and twitchiest, practically leapt from his chair when I delivered the message. "He knows? Already?" His voice cracked. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow as an empty drum. By the time I left, all three were rattled, each in his own way. Wolfe didn't move a muscle when I reported it, but his lips curved, faint as dawn. 2 nights later, Saul called. His voice was calm, measured, but I could hear the weight in it. "Archie, you'd better tell Wolfe. Burnside's been meeting someone off the record. Same cafe, late evenings. He's careful, but not careful enough. The someone is a woman I've seen twice. Early 30s, dark hair, neat. Doesn't belong to the firm. Might be connected to Dunning I passed the news on." Wolfe absorbed it without flinching. "So, Burnside, hungry and reckless, meets clandestinely. This bears scrutiny, but it may also be misdirection." That same night, the brownstone was hit again. Not a full break-in. We keep the locks tight, but Fritz discovered the kitchen window latch tampered with, faint scratches on the frame. Nothing taken, nothing broken, just touched, adjusted, as if someone wanted us to know they'd tried. When I brought Wolfe the report, his face darkened. The trespasser persists. First the file, now the kitchen. Always a token, never a theft. The intent is clear. Which is? I asked. To unsettle, to suggest omnipresence, to force me into haste. His voice rose slightly, which is as close as Wolfe gets to shouting. It will not succeed. But it had succeeded in one way. It made Wolfe angry. And an angry wolf is a dangerous wolf. He summoned Saul again, this time in person. Saul came that evening, slipping in quiet as smoke. We gathered in the office, the mug still resting on Wolfe's desk like an uninvited guest. Saul reported calmly. Burnside isn't the only one with extracurriculars. Lowell's been seen with an importer named Phelps. Questionable reputation. They met twice this week. Long conversations. Money changed hands that got Wolfe's eyes open. "Money," he repeated. "Good." The scent of motive strengthens Grant, Saul added, was keeping his meetings quieter. Mostly the same woman I'd spotted with him, likely a mistress. "Not criminal," Saul said, "but leverage if you needed it." Wolfe closed his eyes again, murmuring, "So, each has a secret, each vulnerable. Yet only one orchestrates the insult." The room fell silent, except for the faint tick of the clock and Saul's steady breathing. Then Wolfe spoke, voice steady as granite. "Archie, tomorrow you will press Burnside further. Apply pressure. If he is weak, he will crumble. If he is not, we will see whose hand moves next." I nodded. "And if the hand moves against us again?" Wolfe's mouth curved, cold and sharp. "Then we close it in our fist." Saul left, melting back into the city, and the brownstone settled into uneasy quiet. I stayed up later than usual, nursing a glass of milk and keeping an ear on the halls. I didn't like the idea of unseen fingers toying with our locks and drawers. But Wolfe had shifted now, from curiosity to command. The trespass had failed to shake him. It had only sharpened his edge. And somewhere out there, Harold Dunning remained missing, the document gone, and the mug still the only object that refused to lose its chill. The next day began like most in the brownstone, with Wolfe planted in his chair, beer within reach, orchids already tended. But there was a difference in the air, a stiffness I'd learned to recognize. Wolfe was no longer just analyzing. He was positioning. That's the stage where every word, every silence, and every move gets chosen not for what it says, but for what it forces the other person to reveal. I'd spent the morning tracking Burnside as ordered. He showed up at the firm early, left early, and, like Saul had reported, slipped off to meet the same dark-haired woman at the cafe. I caught enough of their conversation from a booth near the window to know it wasn't casual. She kept pushing him about something secured and delivered. He kept wringing his hands and insisting Wolfe was close. When I slid out and left, I had no doubt Burnside was dancing in the fire. I reported back mid-afternoon. Wolfe listened, head tilted, eyes shut, like a bishop weighing confessions. When I finished, he spoke without opening his eyes. "So, Mr. Burnside is under pressure, that much is evident. But from whom? And why permit him to remain visible rather than silencing him as Dunning was?" "Maybe they need him," I suggested. "Or maybe he's already compromised, and the lady's just holding the leash." Wolfe opened his eyes then. "Precisely. And men on leashes pull others down with them. It is time to shift the board." He dictated 3 separate letters, one to Grant, requesting his presence at the brownstone to clarify the firm's position, one to Lowell, couched as an invitation to share his expertise regarding confidential contracts, and one to Burnside, worded with surgical precision. Wolfe requested a private interview, noting he had gained knowledge of recent external associations. I typed them, delivered them by hand, and was back in time for dinner. Fritz served squab with truffle sauce, which Wolfe consumed in silence, mind elsewhere. Afterward, in the office, he delivered instructions. "Archie, tomorrow I will see them separately. Not together, yet each will face a question that cannot be answered without risk. Their responses, their evasions, will tell me what I need. You will watch them closely, particularly their eyes." "Sounds like fun," I said. "I'll bring popcorn." The next day was parade time. Grant came first, punctual as a train schedule. Wolfe greeted him with a nod and an inquiry so smooth it almost sounded polite. "Mr. Grant, were you aware Mr. Dunning opposed the firm's entanglement with questionable clients?" Grant's lips pressed thin. "I am aware," Harold voiced concerns. "Lawyers often differ. That is no crime. Yet it is motive," Wolfe murmured. "And you, sir, stand to lose much if the draft emerges altered." Grant bristled, but his eyes flickered left just once before he steadied himself. Wolfe let him leave with nothing more than that. Lowell arrived second, a smile painted on. Wolfe wasted no time. "Mr. Lowell, I am told you have dealings with Mr. Phelps, the importer." That wiped the smile clean. Lowell stammered, then recovered, claiming it was purely social. Wolfe leaned back, eyelids heavy, and said, "Sociality with men of Phelps' reputation is an entanglement." That word hung in the air like a gavel. By the time Lowell slithered out, his polish looked smudged. Burnside was last. He came in jittery, darting glances like a schoolboy caught cheating. Wolfe let him sit in silence for nearly a full minute before speaking. "Mr. Burnside, your associations concern me." Burnside swallowed. "What associations?" "The woman," Wolfe said flatly. "Dark hair. Cafe. Twice this week. Why does she press you for delivery?" His eyes went wide. He tried to deny, then faltered. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Finally he muttered, I can't say." Wolfe's voice cut sharper. "You must. If you do not, the police will." That broke him. He blurted out that the woman's name was Celia Veron, a consultant attached unofficially to the shipping concern. She had pressed him to secure a copy of Dunning's draft. She claimed it was leverage in negotiations, nothing more. He insisted he hadn't given her anything, only promised to keep her informed. Wolfe's nostrils flared. "Pfui! A child's excuse. You're compromised, Mr. Burnside. You will remain silent until summoned." "Leave me." Burnside stumbled out, nearly tripping over the threshold. I followed him with my eyes, then looked back at Wolfe. "Well, that about confirms he's rotten." "Rotten, yes, but not necessarily the architect," Wolfe replied. "He is a pawn, Archie. A pawn does not decide to topple a king. Someone moved him. The question remains, who placed the mug and why?" The day ended with Wolfe sinking deeper into his chair, lips pressed thin, beer untouched beside him. The pieces were aligning, but the picture was still blurred. One thing was certain. Wolfe was no longer just waiting. He was pulling strings, testing fault lines, and every man we faced was beginning to crack. When Fritz came in to clear the glasses, Wolfe stirred at last. "Archie," he said, "tomorrow we summon them all. The stage requires actors present together, and then we shall have our play." I nodded. It was the beginning of the endgame. The mug had stayed cold, the brownstone had been trespassed, and the lawyers had been unmasked, one by one. Now Wolfe was ready to gather them under his roof and finish it. The next evening the brownstone was fuller than Wolfe would have liked, and fuller than I cared for. It was the kind of gathering that put the air under strain, as if too many secrets had been shoved into too small a space. Fritz had set the chairs in a semicircle facing Wolfe's desk, and the beer was poured early to keep him steady. When the doorbell began its chorus, I played usher, guiding each suspect to their seat like an usher at a wedding where nobody wanted to be seen smiling. Grant arrived first, stiff-backed and somber, his jaw locked as if it had been wired that way. Lowell followed, still shining at the edges but showing cracks, the kind of polish that doesn't hide wear when the light hits just right. Burnside came in last, pale and jittery, with Talbot at his side doing his best to maintain the image of respectability that was already falling apart. They sat, and Wolfe, without rising, let the silence settle over them like dust. "Gentlemen," he said at last, his voice calm and deliberate, "you are here because Mr. Dunning is not. His disappearance and the vanishing of a draft central to your firm's survival have left a void. That void has been filled with subterfuge, betrayal, and insult. Nobody spoke." Burnside's hands twitched on his knees. Lowell shifted, but his smile stayed fixed. Grant stared ahead, determined not to blink. Wolfe's eyes closed, then opened again, sharp as blades. "I will not belabor details. Mr. Goodwin has reported your movements, your conversations, your indiscretions. Mr. Panzer has confirmed them. You are all compromised, but compromise alone does not explain the mug." He gestured, and I unwrapped the cloth to place the porcelain on his desk. It looked innocent enough. Just a diner mug, pale rim, faint stain near the handle. But in the silence of the office, it might as well have been a bomb. The mug, Wolfe continued, was not forgotten. It was chosen. It was left cold and untouched, precisely positioned. It was, in essence, a signature, a message to those who would discover it. The act was deliberate. Grant finally spoke, his voice strained. "And you believe one of us left it?" "I do not believe," Wolfe said evenly. "I know. But more importantly, I know why Lowell leaned forward, trying to charm the moment into submission. Then enlighten us. Spare us the drama." "Pfui," Wolfe muttered. "Drama. You, sir, mistake my patience for performance. Very well. Let us proceed." He turned his gaze to Burnside. "Mr. Burnside, you were pressured by Miss Celia Verron. You entertained her demands. You even promised cooperation. Your weakness is obvious, but your courage is lacking. You are no mastermind. You are a tool Burnside wilted in his chair." "I never gave her anything," he said weakly. "Not yet," Wolfe said. "But you would have, had time permitted." "Your leash was short." He shifted his attention to Lowell. "Mr. Lowell, your dealings with Mr. Phelps are less innocent. Money changed hands. The implication is clear. You intended to profit from the disappearance of the draft, to supply it to a man who thrives on commerce at the edges of the law. But you are too vain, too eager to polish your veneer, to orchestrate such a symbolic gesture." "The mug is beneath your aesthetic," Lowell's smile faltered. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Finally, Wolfe turned to Grant, whose face had grown darker by the minute. "Mr. Grant, you have the most to lose. Reputation, authority, the stability of your position. You have also been carrying a personal entanglement, a woman, secret, vulnerable. That entanglement made you cautious, desperate to keep control. But caution does not explain insult." Grant's voice broke like gravel. "You think I placed a coffee mug to taunt my own partners?" Wolfe leaned back, eyelids lowering. "No, not to taunt your partners. To taunt your enemies. To show them that Dunning's disappearance was not a theft but a statement. The mug was not his farewell. It was your flag." The room froze. Burnside sucked in air. Lowell half rose before collapsing back. Talbot made a strangled sound. Grant sat perfectly still, but his hands gripped the chair so tightly the knuckles whitened. "You sought to secure the draft for yourself," Wolfe continued, voice low, steady. "You ensured Dunning vanished, silenced him one way or another. You staged the scene to appear enigmatic, so your colleagues would suspect each other, not you. And you underestimated the insult. You thought the mug a trivial token. But it revealed too much. Only a man steeped in habit, rigid in control, would have positioned it so carefully Grant's jaw trembled. This is absurd. You have no proof. Wolfe's lips thinned. Proof? The mug itself is proof. The absence of fingerprints where they should be, the careful placement, the deliberate coldness, and the trespass into my house, into my files. Another assertion of control. Who among you would dare such audacity? Not Mr. Burnside, who quails at confrontation. Not Mr. Lowell, who hides behind polish. Only you, Mr. Grant, who believes authority is a shield. But here, it is not. Grant rose then, too fast. His chair scraping back, his face was flushed, his breath harsh. You twist shadows into accusations. I did what I had to. Dunning was reckless. He would have destroyed us all with his doubts. The draft was safe in my hands, safer than in his. Silence slammed the room. Lowell stared at him with open shock, Burnside with terror. Talbot buried his face in his hands. Wolfe didn't move. He simply exhaled, long and slow. So, the truth is out. Whether the law takes it or not, the fact remains. You orchestrated the insult. You shattered your partner and thought yourself invincible. I stepped forward then, hand steady, eyes on Grant. He looked at me as if realizing too late that his fortress had no walls left. Wolfe closed his eyes again, dismissing him with silence. The gathering was over. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The mug sat cold on the desk, triumphant in its simplicity, and I knew, as I guided the broken men out of the brownstone, that Wolfe had done it again. Not by moving, not by force, but by speaking the truth no one wanted to hear until it was undeniable. Grant's confession didn't come in a shout. It leaked out of him like air from a punctured tire. He stood rigid, trembling, his words still ringing in the office like a bell that refused to stop. Dunning was reckless. The draft was safer in his hands. Safer for whom? He didn't say, but the silence carried its own answer. Lowell slumped, his polish stripped away, and Burnside sat as if his strings had been cut. Talbot, poor Courier Talbot, looked like he'd walked his firm into a guillotine and realized it too late. Wolfe let the silence build. He has a way of using silence as a hammer, pounding until the guilty break themselves against it. Finally, he opened his eyes, dark and steady, and spoke with the measured cadence of a man building a case brick by brick. "You claim safety, Mr. Grant, yet your actions speak otherwise." Harold Dunning opposed the firm's alignment with certain clients. He feared compromise. He feared corruption. You saw that opposition not as loyalty to the law, but as betrayal of ambition. You silenced him, and in silencing him, you sought to preserve your own authority. Grant's jaw tightened, but his eyes betrayed him. He glanced once at Talbot, then away. That glance told me more than any words. The mug, Wolfe went on, was not left by chance. It was placed precisely in the center of the desk, where it could not be ignored. Not toppled, not hidden. Untouched, cold, waiting. Why? Because you wished to cloak your act in enigma. You wished your partners to suspect each other, to whisper and gnaw at themselves while you appeared blameless. A symbol carefully chosen. Not flamboyant, not vulgar. Something ordinary made extraordinary by context. That is your style. Mr. Grant Lowell found his voice brittle as glass. "Edward, my God, is this true?" Grant snapped his head toward him, face flushed. "You were no saint, Lowell. Don't pretend. Your dealings with Phelps, your hunger for profit. How long before you sold us out entirely?" "Enough." Wolfe's voice cut through like a cleaver. "Each of you has your sins. Mr. Lowell, your entanglements are indeed sordid, but they are opportunistic, not foundational. You did not stage this. Mr. Burnside, your ambition made you pliable, but you lacked the spine for orchestration. No, it is Grant who carried both motive and method. He alone had the discipline to plan not only Dunning's removal, but the performance of the mug." Burnside muttered, almost to himself, "Then where is Dunning?" It was the question I had been waiting for, the one hanging in the room like smoke. Wolfe's lids lowered, then rose. "Dead," he said flatly. "Almost certainly. A man may vanish with a document, but he does not vanish so completely unless compelled. Your trespasses here, Mr. Grant, confirm as much. You entered my house. You sought to know what I knew, to ensure I could not point the finger too soon. That arrogance betrays you." Talbot's face went white. "My God. You mean we've been protecting a murderer?" "You have been protecting your firm," Wolfe corrected. "A distinction without a difference." Grant lurched forward, voice raw. "You cannot prove this in court." "You have deductions, suspicions, words." "Nothing more." "Perhaps," Wolfe admitted. "The law may struggle. But I do not answer to the law. I answer to truth. And the truth is this. Harold Dunning resisted your ambitions. You removed him. You crafted a scene with a cold mug as both misdirection and declaration. You trespassed upon my sanctum to unsettle me. And now you stand exposed, not by witnesses or evidence, but by the weight of your own precision. That is enough." The words hung, heavy and final. Grant sagged back into his chair, drained, his bluster leaking away. Lowell shook his head in disbelief, and Burnside buried his face in his hands. Talbot rose unsteadily, as if the room itself had betrayed him. I broke the silence because someone had to. "So what's next, boss?" We hand him to the cops with a mug and a theory. Wolfe's gaze turned to me, and there was no softness in it. We hand him nothing. Mr. Grant will face his partners. His firm will fracture. His name will rot. That is justice of a kind more piercing than prison. Grant's lips trembled, but he said nothing. He knew Wolfe was right. The mug had been his weapon, his riddle, his assertion of control. Now it was the instrument of his undoing. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closing once more, dismissing them all. "Archie, see them out." I did. One by one they filed from the office, diminished men. Lowell muttering under his breath, Burnside stumbling, Talbot pale as chalk. Grant last, shoulders hunched, his authority stripped bare. When the door shut behind him, the brownstone exhaled, as if relieved to be rid of them. I went back to Wolfe, who hadn't moved. The mug still sat on the desk, silent, ordinary, terrible. "Well," I said, "you've toppled another tower without lifting a finger. Congratulations. Want me to call the press, or should I just send flowers to Dunning's widow?" "Pfui," Wolfe muttered. "The world will know soon enough. Ambition exposes itself. Betrayal corrodes. I need not assist." I sank into my chair, shaking my head. All that fuss, all that plotting, all that trespassing. And it comes down to a mug of cold coffee. I'll never look at breakfast the same way again. Wolfe closed his eyes, and for the first time in days, reached for his beer. He drank, long and deep, then set the glass down with a sigh that sounded like satisfaction. The case wasn't over in the legal sense. It rarely is. But in the brownstone, where insult carries weight and truth is sharper than law, it was finished. The brownstone always breathes easier after the last client leaves. The echo of their shoes fades, the door shuts, and silence seeps back into the rooms like a balm. Fritz returned to the kitchen with relief, and Theodore's humming from upstairs floated faint and steady, like the orchids hadn't cared a whit that a man had all but confessed to orchestrating the ruin of his own firm in the office below. That was the brownstone for you. Chaos in, calm out. I dropped into my chair across from Wolfe and stretched. Well, that's that. The partners know, Talbot knows, and Grant knows the game is up. You want me to phone the police or just send a condolence card to the Bar Association? Wolfe's eyes remained closed, his fingers steepled. Neither. The law will follow its own course once the fracture widens. Talbot will not contain it. Lowell will seize the chance to protect himself, and Burnside will babble. Soon enough, the authorities will have their corpse. They will call it a tragedy of ambition, and so it is. I blew smoke toward the ceiling. And the mug. He opened one eye, just slightly, as if to confirm it still sat on the desk. It remains. Cold, deliberate, unremarkable in itself, yet decisive. A vulgar utensil elevated into a declaration. That is human folly distilled, Archie. The urge to transform banality into power, to leave behind a gesture in place of substance. In the end, it condemns its maker. Nice epitaph for a coffee cup, I said. Want me to toss it, or should we build a shrine? Pfui. Have Fritz dispose of it. I will not have reminders of impertinence. Lingering dinner followed in its usual fashion, as though betrayal and confession were as common as soup and squab. Fritz served braised duck, tender and fragrant, and Wolfe devoted himself to it with his customary absorption, chewing as if philosophy itself depended on it. I ate too, but my mind wandered back over the faces from earlier. The stiff collapse of Grant, the smooth veneer cracking on Lowell, Burnside flailing like a fish on a dock. Men undone not by bullets or blades, but by pride, fear, and a mug they hadn't known how to ignore. When the plates were cleared and Wolfe reached for his final beer of the evening, he leaned back, eyes heavy, voice low. Ambition, Archie, is the most common of poisons. It kills discretion, corrodes loyalty, blinds judgment. Mr. Grant believed ambition made him invulnerable. Instead, it made him conspicuous. Dunning resisted, and he paid with his life. But the irony endures. The man who sought to control all revealed himself through a trifle, a vessel for coffee. I stubbed out my cigarette and smirked. So the mighty fall not with a bang, but with a mug. Wolfe allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch, his version of a laugh. Apartment human vanity prefers symbols, and symbols betray. That was his last word on the matter. He closed his eyes, sank deeper into the chair, and left me with the tick of the clock and the faint clatter of Fritz in the kitchen. The brownstone was quiet again, its sanctity restored. Outside, the city churned with its usual noise, none the wiser. And me? I sat there thinking about Harold Dunning, about ambition's price, and about the cold mug that had told the truth better than any witness. Then I got up, filed my notes, and turned off the lights. Cases end, clients vanish, and life in the brownstone keeps going. That's the rhythm. That's Wolfe. And lucky me, I get the front row seat, 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 get the front row seat.